This is a great example of cooperation between our countries. Look forward to it opening. The president asked appropriately that his ambassador, who's from Michigan, of course, play a role in smoothing the conversation in and around the bridge. So it was a positive conversation.
This negotiation is specific to the bridge. The new bridge, the Gordie Howe Bridge, is Canadian-owned and operated. And there's a concern, a valid concern on the part of the president, that this bridge was allowed to be built.
Make no mistake about it, as sure as I'm talking to you, I'm very confident this bridge is going to open. I'll tell you the reason why it's going to open, because it's in the best interest of the American economy.
The Canadians have paid for the bridge. The bridge was built with organized labor, union labor on both sides of the bridge. It is important that it continue.
Reaction there from both sides of the border on the latest threat to Canada from Donald Trump. He's claiming he will block the opening of the Gordie Howe International Bridge connecting Ontario and Michigan. Trump says the U.S. should own at least half of the $6.4 billion bridge and claims it has virtually no U.S. content. To be clear, Canada funded the construction of the bridge in its entirety, used American and Canadian labor and materials, and will recoup its costs through a toll. Once Canada's costs are recouped, there is a deal with Michigan to share in the toll revenues 50-50. So what now? Let's bring in our front bench. Former senior advisor to the Liberal Ontario governments of Dalton McGuinty and Kathleen Wynne, Dan Moulton is here in studio. He's now a partner with Crestview Strategy. Larissa Waller is the founder of Hanley Strategies. She's a former head of communications for Ontario's Conservative Premier, Doug Ford. Kathleen Monk, also in studio, is former director of communications to the late Jack Layton. She is now the principal owner of Monk and Associates. And Laura Stone rounds us out tonight. She's a Queen's Park reporter for the Globe and Mail. Hi, everybody.
Hey there.
Nice to see you, Dan. I'll start with you. There's just so many obviously false things about the way in which Trump is positioning this, from a lack of American involvement to costs that they might be out. Like, none of it is true. Let's be blunt. So why do you think, and I know it's hard to discern, but like, what do you think is really going on here?
Well, I think a couple of things are going on. One, this is going to be a preview of our experience over the course of the next year as we head into the USMCA renegotiations, where the president's going to find any particular grievance he can to claim that the U.S. is a victim of Canada and that we've been taking advantage of them and we have to do something about this really one-sided relationship. And he's been doing that for a year. He's going to do it for the next year and the years ahead. And we have to kind of get used to expecting these late-night tweets of the thing that's most recently grabbed his attention. I think in this case, the owners and operators of the Ambassador Bridge have for a long time been opposed to the development of the Gordie Howe Bridge and have fought it since its inception and pretty much every step of the way. They've clearly gotten the ear of the president on this one, and he made this foray last night. What I will say is I think what Canadians saw from Mark Carney today is exactly what they want from him, right? Which is a pretty calm demeanor about it, a commitment to continuing to have conversations with the president, an update on the conversations he had with the president, and an indication that we're going to find a resolution here. Because as you laid out there very bluntly, all of this that the president has put out there is factually incorrect. It's easily disputable, and hopefully it'll be easy for us to find a resolution and get the bridge open in the way that Premier Ford indicated it would be today.
It feels, Kathleen, in just the way that he looped in with all the others, with the bridge stuff, you know, China, Ontario liquor, a whole host of dairy, you know, it had very, like, you know, vibes from 8 months ago or something, when everything was about sort of a negotiating strategy in a way. Do you think that's what this is?
Well, ultimately, I think it's what Dan just spoke about. It's Trump's plan to constantly do payola policy. Like, you pay to Trump, you fundraise for Trump, which this owner of the bridge has, and you get the policy. It's the concierge for corporate USA. Like, that's what Trump does, and that's what he's doing here. And what I was impressed by today, actually, though, was the speed at which Canadian elected officials, whether it was Premier Ford or Carney or others, you know, moved out with the same talking points and really quickly. And even you saw the governor there as well in that clip you just played. She also, you know, touted the same talking points. We're talking shared labor, right? Concrete from both sides, steel from both sides, paid for by Canada. It's a government to government, actually, you know, shared project. And more than that, Ford went even a little bit further and actually laid out the electoral consequences, citing that there are midterms coming up where there are 13 different Republicans, or 13 different seats up for grabs, 7 of which are Republicans, that are at risk if this bridge doesn't go forward with. You know, we've seen the Ambassador Bridge in the past shut down. It did during the Freedom Convoy in 2022. We need this bridge to move people, trade, traffic, all that stuff. And that's why it's going to be successful no matter how much Trump and his payola policy of you pay and you get the policy you want is going to do, because Americans and Canadians on both sides of the border recognize that this is needed.
Well, even in 2017, so did Donald Trump.
That's right.
Ironically,
he
right?
fast-tracked it, yeah.
Kathleen's point, I think, Larissa, is well taken on the way in which governments of all levels and elected officials actually address this today. And I will point out, like, it hasn't been the case always that we can get ministers to stop, or in particular the prime minister to stop, and not dismiss the question about Trump as an irrelevant one. He didn't do that today. He spoke pretty directly about the call that had happened with the president to, like what Kathleen said, Premier Ford spoke out as well. We had a bunch of ministers who engaged on the subject as well. I get it. The talking points have the benefit in this case of being true. But what do you think of that approach? And do you think ultimately it's a good one to take versus, you know, trying to avoid talking about it?
You know, I commend the Prime Minister and his tone. He really struck the right tone here, where he wasn't dismissive. He wasn't even rude towards the president. He said, you know, he rightly wants the American ambassador, who's from Michigan, to be part of smoothing the path forward. I mean, what he was probably thinking is what all of us are thinking, is that this is ludicrous. The facts are not on the president's side, and the president would know that, given that he fast-tracked this project in 2017 while he was the president, and he knows how important the Windsor-Detroit crossing is to both economies. In Canada, 25% of all truck traffic comes through that corridor. We need increased capacity, and the Premier of Ontario was right to point out that it's the U.S. economy that will suffer in addition to the Canadian economy should that bridge not go forward. The Prime Minister, I think, wanted to probably say what he really thought, but he restrained himself, and I commend him for that. But it doesn't matter what the facts are. The president will tweet out anything, right? The truth does not matter. And so when rational people need to speak to that, because rational people run the provinces and the country and the other states, but they have to respond to this crazy person who has a phone and unfettered access to Truth Social. It's hard to strike that tone of, I'm the adult in the room, I'm not going to be disrespectful, I'm not going to be dismissive, but I have to let the people know that this is in fact crazy.
Yeah, Laura, I think you were there for Premier Ford's comments. What's your thoughts on the way in which sort of Premier and Prime Minister and other politicians are approaching this?
I think the tone was notable. I mean, they tried to keep things calm. They didn't ratchet up the rhetoric, but they did address this issue head on. And I think, you know, at times politicians are tired, quite frankly, as is the Canadian public, to have to respond to every single thing that President Trump says, particularly about Canada. And we've seen kind of the fatigue on the part of the Prime Minister at times to even talk about this. I think it was important that he stopped, even if it was brief. It was only a couple of minutes, but I think it probably did reassure a lot of people that he had spoken to President Trump and is trying to maintain a calm and measured tone when it comes to this. You know, Premier Ford has really stood his ground when it comes to dealing with the Trump administration. That's probably what he believes that his constituents in Ontario want to hear. And he did say today that one of the grievances from the president in that post was about removing the U.S. alcohol from the LCBO shelves. And Premier Ford said that he's not going to do that, and he thinks Canada should stand its ground and shouldn't buckle over to President Trump. And that's probably a pretty popular message. It's a fine line, though, because we've seen that backfire in some instances when it comes to the negotiations. But overall, I mean, I think the Prime Minister addressed it briefly, that this is probably all tied into the USMCA, the renegotiation or the review of the trade agreement, and the president setting that up. So I think everyone kind of has to take a breath and take it all with a grain of salt, but it is important to address it and to be transparent with the public.